A true story of family, fury, and forgiveness. My son locked. The key didn't turn. I stood on my own porch, the same warped wooden porch I'd repaired 3 summers ago with my own 2 hands, and I turned the key left, then right, then left again, the way you do when a lock is being stubborn, as though coaxing it like a difficult conversation. But this wasn't a stubborn lock. The deadbolt had been changed. My name was on the deed to this house. My blood had soaked into its walls, my sweat into its foundation. And my 17-year-old son, Daniel, had changed the locks while I was at work. I remember the exact quality of the light that Tuesday evening. Late October, the kind of dusk that arrives too soon, painting everything in bruised oranges and the color of old photographs. I was still in my work clothes, grey slacks, a blue button-down I'd had since my sister's wedding, my good shoes that squeaked on wet pavement. I had a brown paper bag of groceries in my left arm, a rotisserie chicken, 2 sweet potatoes, a bunch of kale because Daniel had told me 3 weeks earlier that he wanted to eat healthier. 3 weeks earlier, before everything fell apart. I set the bag down on the porch railing. I knocked, not the knock of a guest, the knock of a man trying very hard not to lose his composure on his own front step. Daniel, my voice was steady, I was proud of that. Daniel, I know you're in there, open the door, son. Silence, then from somewhere deep inside the house, from the kitchen I thought, or maybe the hallway, the muffled sound of a television. He was watching something. He was in there watching something, while his father stood on the porch with a bag of groceries and a key that no longer worked. 6 months earlier. To understand what happened that October evening, you need to understand what my son and I had been through in the 2 years before it, what we had survived, what perhaps we had failed to survive together. My name is Daniel S.R. Yes, I named my boy after myself, a decision my ex-wife called the first sign of my ego, which I always thought was a bit much coming from a woman who named our cat after herself. My son, Daniel Jr., came into the world screaming, which he never really stopped doing, and which I never really stopped interpreting as passion rather than anger. That distinction, my therapist would later tell me, was one of my more expensive blind spots. His mother, Renee, and I separated when Daniel was 11. I won't assign blame here. I've had enough years and enough therapy sessions to understand that the collapse of a marriage is never the clean story either person tells themselves at the beginning. What I will say is that Daniel took it hard, harder than we expected, harder than children are supposed to, or maybe exactly as hard as children always do, and we were simply too wrapped up in our own grief to notice for a long time. He came to live with me when he was 15. Renee had moved to Portland for work, a decision Daniel never forgave her for, even if he never said so directly. He asked to stay in the same city, the same school, the same bedroom he'd had since childhood. I said yes without hesitation. Of course I said yes, he was my son. I thought love was enough. I thought proximity was connection. I had confused being present in the same house with being present in his life. What I didn't fully reckon with, what I understand now, standing on the other side of everything that happened, was that Daniel didn't just need a roof. He needed someone who was actually paying attention. And I, consumed by the demands of a new job, the peculiar loneliness of a recently divorced man in his late 40s, and the assumption that teenagers need space more than they need conversation, had been failing to provide that in ways I was too oblivious to see. He started pulling away in small ways first. Later bedtimes, dinners eaten alone in his room, shorter answers to my questions until eventually my questions stopped getting answers at all. I told myself it was normal. I told myself every father of a teenager goes through this. I looked up articles online, why is my teenager shutting me out? And took comfort in knowing I wasn't alone without ever doing anything meaningful about it. What I didn't know, what I would only learn later in the most painful possible way, was that Daniel had been struggling with something serious for nearly a year. He had anxiety that had quietly metastasized into something closer to depression. He had been failing 2 of his classes. He had a group of online friends I knew nothing about, and a situation developing within that community that had been causing him genuine distress. He had tried to tell me, that is the part that lives in me now like a splinter I can't reach. He had tried, in his sideways teenage way, to signal that something was wrong. A comment dropped at dinner that I had responded to with half attention because I was checking my phone. A moment in the car when he'd gone quiet in a particular way that I had noticed but not pursued. A night, I remember this now with the horrible clarity of hindsight, when he'd appeared in the doorway of my home office at 11 o'clock, and I'd looked up from my laptop and said, "Not now, buddy, I've got an early call," and turned back to my screen. He'd said okay and gone back to his room. And I had gone back to my email. The fight that preceded the lock changing had happened on a Sunday morning. I had found his report card not snooping. It had fallen from his backpack onto the kitchen floor, and I had picked it up the way you pick up something that has fallen without any thought of the detonation inside. 2 Fs, 3 Ds, a single B in art class, which under any other circumstances I would have celebrated. I confronted him the way men of my generation were taught to confront things, directly, bluntly, and with a certainty that I was right that I had not earned. I raised my voice. I used the word unacceptable more times than I'm proud of. I said things about potential, about wasted opportunity, about what I had sacrificed, as though my sacrifices were a debt he owed me, as though his suffering was a character defect rather than a cry for help. He sat at the kitchen table and took it. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, and which I now recognize as the look of a person who has decided, quietly and finally, that they are completely alone. 3 days later, I came home to a changed lock. The longest night. I stood on that porch for 20 minutes. I called his cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text. Daniel, please open the door. We can talk. I'm listening now. Nothing. I called Renee in Portland. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting for a call like this, which told me she knew things I didn't, which told me I had a much longer road ahead of me than I had imagined, standing there with my squeaky shoes and my bag of groceries and my useless key. He called me last week, she said. Her voice was careful in the way voices get when they are carrying more emotion than they are willing to show. He talked to me for 2 hours, Daniel, 2 hours. About what? A pause, about everything, about how scared he's been, about school, about she stopped. He didn't tell you any of this. I looked at the front door of my house, at the new lock catching the last of the porch light. No, I said, he didn't. She said, he didn't lock you out of the house, Daniel. He locked you out because you were never really in. I sat on the porch steps. The October cold had fully arrived now, settling into the concrete, into my bones. The bag of groceries sat beside me, the kale already wilting, the chicken cooling inside its plastic shell. Renee talked for a long time. She told me about Daniel's anxiety, about the months he'd been struggling. About the online situation I won't detail here, because it is his story to tell, not mine, but which was serious enough that I felt physically ill sitting there in the dark listening to it. She told me about the doorway moment, the night I'd sent him back to his room with "Not now, buddy." He'd told her about it. That had been the night, she said, that he'd stopped trying. When she finished, I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "What do I do?" "You wait," she said, "and when he opens that door, and he will, you don't defend yourself. You don't explain. You just listen, for as long as he needs, and then you listen some more." What shocked everyone. What happened next is the part that people always want to know about when I tell this story. The part that earns the headlines, so to speak. But I want to be careful here because the shocking part isn't dramatic in the way people expect. There was no screaming match, no police, no dramatic breakthrough moment set to swelling music. Real life, I've learned, doesn't work like that. I sat on those porch steps for 3 hours. I didn't pace. I didn't call again. I just sat there in the dark with the cold and the wilting kale and the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night around me. At some point the porch light flicked on. Daniel had turned it on from inside, which meant he knew I was still there, which meant something. At 9:47, the deadbolt turned. He opened the door and stood in the frame, and he looked at me with that same terrible expression from the kitchen table, and I looked up at him from the steps, and for a moment neither of us said a word. He was still my boy. He had my jawline and his mother's eyes, and a hoodie I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago that he was still wearing, which for reasons I couldn't explain made something crack open in my chest. "You stayed," he said. His voice was hoarse. He'd been crying, I realized. For how long, I didn't know. "Of course I stayed," I said. "Where would I go?" He looked at me for another long moment. Then he stepped aside and I walked through the door of my own house and I sat down on the couch and I said, "I'm listening. Tell me everything." And he did. He talked until 2 in the morning. He told me about the anxiety that had been building since the divorce, about the shame of his grades and his terror that I would see him as a failure, about the online situation that had been consuming him, about the night in the doorway, my God, that doorway, and how it had felt like confirmation of something he'd been afraid was true, that I had stopped seeing him. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I did what Renee told me to do. I listened. When he finished, I told him I was sorry. Not a performative sorry, not the sorry of a man managing a situation. The sorry of a father who had looked up from his laptop and realized he'd missed something essential, something irreplaceable, and that the only honest thing he could offer now was the truth of his own failure and the commitment to do differently. He cried. I held him, awkwardly, the way fathers and teenage sons hold each other, neither of us quite sure of the geometry of it anymore. And then around 2 in the morning, he fell asleep on the couch, and I covered him with the blanket from the arm of the chair. and I sat in the kitchen and looked at the brown paper bag still on the counter, the rotisserie chicken, the sweet potatoes, the kale, and I thought about all the dinners I'd made for this boy and how food is not the same as attention, and a roof is not the same as safety, and being in the same house is not the same as being present. What came after? The morning after was not a fairy tale. I want to be honest about that. Daniel and I did not emerge from that night as a fixed thing, the way a broken vase is fixed with glue whole again, just with some visible cracks. Healing, I've learned, is not an event, it's a direction. It's the decision you make every morning to keep walking towards someone, especially on the days when it's easier to look away. We found Daniel a therapist within the week, Dr. Amara, a patient woman with an office full of plants who told me in our first joint session that my son was deeply perceptive and deeply frightened, and that the two things had been colliding in him for years. We started family sessions, the three of us, me, Daniel, and Renee joining by video from Portland, which were some of the most uncomfortable and most necessary hours of my adult life. Daniel's grades did not miraculously recover. He finished the semester with a D average and had to retake one course over the summer. He didn't get into the college he'd casually assumed he would attend. He was devastated by that, and then slowly he wasn't. He found a smaller school that felt right in a way the bigger one never had, and he made friends there, real ones, the kind you meet in the mess of actual proximity rather than the curated distance of a screen. The lock, by the way, he replaced himself. He bought a new deadbolt and handed me the key with a formality that made us both laugh, the first time we'd laughed together in what felt like years. It was a small thing. It was everything. He handed me the key, and in that moment, I understood that the door had never really been about the lock. It had always been about whether I would stay. What shocked people when I began telling this story, at first to close friends, then to my brother, eventually to anyone who needed to hear it, was not the lock changing itself. It wasn't the 3 hours on the cold porch or the 2 a.m. conversation, or even the realization of how badly I'd been failing him without knowing it. What shocked people was how simple the turning point was, how unspectacular. How quiet. A boy opens a door, a father walks in and sits down. No conditions, no agenda, just tell me everything. That's it, that's the whole trick. And somehow, in a culture that tells fathers to fix things, to solve things, to correct and discipline and instruct, that simple act of sitting down and being willing to be wrong felt like the most radical thing I'd ever done. What I know now. Daniel is 22 as I write this. He calls me every Sunday, his idea, not mine, and we talk for an hour about whatever is on his mind. His classes, his friends, a book he's been reading, a film that made him feel something he can't quite articulate. I listen to all of it. I have learned to love the articulate and the inarticulate equally, to sit in the silence between his sentences rather than rushing to fill it. It took me a long time to learn that listening is not passive. Listening, real listening, is the most active thing a person can do. Last Thanksgiving, he gave a toast at dinner. Just the three of us, me, him, Renee, who had driven down from Portland, and he held up his glass and said, to Dad, who sat on the porch. He said it like a joke, because we have the gift now of being able to joke about it. But his eyes were serious when he said it, and mine were serious when I clinked my glass against his, and Renee was smiling the way people smile when they are witnessing something being healed. I think about that porch a lot, about those 3 hours in the cold. I've come to understand them as the most important 3 hours of my fatherhood, not because of anything I said or did, but because of what I didn't do. I didn't leave. I didn't force the door. I didn't call a locksmith out of pride or entitlement, though I could have. I just stayed. I waited in the cold with the wilting kale and the cooling chicken and the useless key and the faith, however desperate and trembling, that eventually the door would open. And it did. It always does when you're willing to wait long enough, and when the person on the other side finally believes you're not going anywhere. If there is anything I would say to a father standing on a porch like that one, or a mother, a son, a daughter, anyone locked out of someone they love, it is this: the lock is not the problem. The lock is the symptom. Somewhere inside that house is a person who changed it because they were afraid, or because they were hurting, or because they needed to know if you would stay. And the only answer that means anything is the one you give with your presence, not your words. Sit down on the step, pull your coat tighter, wait. The door will open, and when it does, walk in and say, I'm listening, tell me everything. And then, for the love of everything that matters in this short and complicated life, mean it. For every parent who has stood at a locked door, and every child who has stood on the other side of one.